Florida is a difficult team to peg. They've played close games against some really solid opponents, but have also turned in some clunkers against teams who just aren't very good. A lot of that has to do with how their team is set up under first-year head coach Billy Napier. Their defense has been painfully mediocre all season, but their offense has flashes of brilliance that has allowed them to put up points on elite defenses. The temptation is to look at their quarterback, Anthony Richardson, and figure that as he goes, he brings the offense with him. Richardson is an elite athlete that has all of the physical tools necessary to flourish at the position, but he's plagued with inconsistency. On short to intermediate routes, he has a tendency to be either inaccurate or lack touch and make life difficult for his receivers. However, when he's on, he has the speed to house any run and the arm to take the top off the defense, and Florida has molded their offense to cater to these strengths. First and foremost, the Gators want to establish the run. They have one of the better running attacks in the country in terms of yards per play. They tend to line up in heavy bunch sets with two tight ends and run a lot of outside zone, which gets their line moving horizontally in order to open holes for their backs Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne, who both have the strength and speed combination to break explosive plays with the smallest gaps. This running game opens up the play action game, where Florida likes running crossing routes that get behind these linebackers that cheat up to stop the zone run. The passing game then lives off of shot plays. Specifically, they like going to this deep post if they get man matchups on the outside. If the defense then hangs back too far, they like to go to this deep hitch, where the receiver sells like he's going on a deep route before settling down for an easy 10 to 15 yard completion. So while it's easy to just say that the key is to stop the run or to stop Richardson, I want to take a deeper dive into what some teams have tried that has slowed down this Gator offense, and perhaps just as importantly, what teams have tried that have failed to stop them. Let's go all the way back to their second game of the season where Kentucky completely stifled this offense. Generally, if teams want to stop the run, they have to roll an extra safety into the box in order to have adequate numbers. Kentucky was able to keep two safeties back while still shutting down the run game. This put extra pressure on a relatively green Anthony Richardson, who admittedly didn't have his best night. But I think this perspective robs Kentucky a bit of the stellar gameplay they had to make his life more difficult. The Wildcats played head games with Richardson all night. Here Florida is running a smash concept with a corner route and a hitch. Richardson thinks that Kentucky is in some kind of cover 2 here, where the corner is playing the flats, which should mean that the corner route is open. But Kentucky rotates late into cover 3, which means that this corner now drops into his pre-snap read. This moment of confusion means he hesitates long enough to blow the play up. The next time the Gators go to a similar concept, Kentucky is lined up with one deep safety. Immediately post-snap, they roll to cover 2, and this corner, who technically has the flats, and by extension this hitch, does a good enough job of getting under this corner route to again cause some hesitation for Richardson. Later in the game, Richardson sees what he thinks is cover 4, which means that this corner is almost definitely dropping back on the snap. And he's already been tricked twice trying to hit the deep ball instead of hitting the quick hitch underneath. However, Kentucky again lies to him and they jump this quick hitch to take it back to the house. While Kentucky played a great defensive game, it's not one that's entirely replicable. Most defenses can't sit back with two safeties and shut down the run game, and Richardson has learned from some of the mistakes he made in that game. So most defenses have to make a choice. Are they willing to let Florida's running backs feast? Or are they going to challenge Richardson to beat them with his arm? Tennessee chose what seems to be the lesser of two evils. For most of the game, they rolled that extra safety in the box to try to shut down the run. And they were able to for the most part, holding the Gators to a relatively poor 3.36 yards per rush. However, that left them a bit vulnerable to the pass, and they ended up letting the Gators have 10 plus yards per attempt through the air. Here's a pretty clear example of how that happens. Florida noticed early that Tennessee was bringing this Sam linebacker off the edge on a run blitz. So they go to this RPO where Richardson reads this backer, and if he comes, like he does here, Richardson replaces him outside on a hitch for a big gain. Tennessee might have been able to get away with this aggressiveness towards the run if they weren't also aggressive in the passing game, lining up in press where the corner lines up within a couple of yards of the receiver on 83% of snaps, which allowed Florida to create explosives. While this game ended as a win for Tennessee, it certainly doesn't feel like it from a defensive perspective, giving up a whopping 3.3 points per drive. Florida's next opponent took a completely different approach and got radically different results. Missouri was the most conservative team in how they defended Florida so far this season. They only pressed on 29% of snaps, the lowest rate by a fair margin, and they generally sat back with 2 high safeties and allowed Florida to run the ball. Florida ended up accumulating a whopping 7.22 yards per carry as Mizzou mostly focused on limiting the passing game, holding the Gators to only 4.7 yards per attempt. The soft cover 3 and cover 4 zones they played did a good job allowing the safeties to keep their eyes on Florida's crossing routes and forcing Richardson to live on underneath passes. They also did a good job prepping for UF's passing game. Do you remember how I said that Florida will go to this deep hitch when they see the defense is playing off coverage? Mizzou adjusted this by cutting their underneath zone defenders underneath the hitch. By taking away almost all of UF's deep and intermediate concepts, Mizzou effectively stalled their passing game. And while this did allow for explosives in the run game, they did a good job of limiting these plays before they resulted in points, which is a bigger deal than you might expect. Mizzou's defense held the Gators to only 1.7 points per drive, the Gators' 3rd lowest on the season, behind Kentucky and Georgia's efforts. But I feel like there's more to learn from this performance since Mizzou isn't working with as elite of athletes as the other two. They managed to stop the Gators by limiting their explosives in the passing game and keeping the big runs out of the end zone. So did teams learn from this experience moving forward? For LSU, the answer is mostly. They were fairly conservative in the passing game with a press rate of 38%, the 2nd lowest of the season, mostly employing a softer zone cover 3. This still forced some checkdowns in the passing game, but having only one central safety isn't as effective as cover 4 in stopping the deep crosses the Gators like to run. But despite being more talented on defense than Mizzou and employing a similar strategy, they gave up a dismal 3.5 points per drive. This mostly comes down to one thing that sounds kind of obvious, but is vitally important. When UF got explosives, LSU allowed them to get into the end zone. Where Mizzou mostly forced the Gators to convert in the red zone, the Tigers didn't. And this makes a difference when facing the 119th ranked offense in terms of red zone scoring percentage. So to be transparent, I wrote all of this before Florida played Vanderbilt. But that game is worth diving into for a second because it kind of proves the point that I'm trying to make. Vanderbilt does not have a traditionally good defense. Their defensive F+ ranking, which is a combination of 2 highly respected opponent-adjusted advanced metrics, at the time of this writing has them as 102nd best defense in the country. That being said, they far outplayed their metrics against Florida, holding them to a respectable 2.18 points per drive. They did this mostly by sitting in a soft cover 4 and forcing UF to drive the length of the field. Despite keeping 2 safeties back, they were still able to shut down the Florida run game. Since they only really run zone runs, the defensive line knew they didn't have to necessarily beat their guy, they just had to stagnate them to blow up the runs. Plus, this zone allowed the safeties and linebackers freedom to come down and limit the run plays. While this strategy meant that the Commodores gave up a ton of yards, the fact that they forced the Gators to convert in the red zone meant that they didn't give up a ton of points. So how does this relate to FSU? Does the Noles defensive strategy suit itself well for this game? The short answer is probably, but let me first cover a few caveats and concerns that FSU fans should have. UF runs a ton of bunch sets, sitting at the 4th highest rate in the country, and while FSU's defense has been borderline elite when not facing bunch sets, they're far from it when they do. They're currently 107th in yards per play on bunch sets over 159 snaps, and 5th in yards per play on non-bunch plays. While it's fair to blame some of this on communication issues in the passing game, they also struggle to limit run plays out of bunch sets, potentially because they force the corners to be a presence in the running game. Point 2 against the Noles is Anthony Richardson himself. He can be a truly elite quarterback when he wants to be, and at a certain point this game is made for the offense to win if all things are equal. There's a decent chance that he puts the team on his back and wills points into existence for the Gators, especially if he's able to consistently find creases scrambling once the pocket breaks down. However, I just don't think it's terribly likely for this to be a game that he particularly thrives in. FSU is one of the better teams in the country at limiting explosives, currently sitting at 13th in opponent explosive play rate, and they've only given up 3 touchdowns of 25 or more yards, which is second in the country. A lot of this comes down to FSU's insistence on playing cover 4, coming at the 16th highest rate in the country. Florida's offense has been its least effective against cover 4 of all defenses, and that's before Vandy shut them down utilizing the coverage heavily. FSU should be able to score on Florida, and I think they're a decent matchup for Richardson's offense. Norvell's team should be able to beat a first-year head coach on his first trip to Tallahassee. But when you're dealing with an explosive offense like the Gators have on rivalry weekend, anything can happen. Thanks for sticking with me through this longer format video. If you're a Florida fan, let me know how I did in the comments below and let me know what you disagree with so we can learn more about your team. If you're a Florida State fan, please like and subscribe and check out more great FSU news and information on Noles 247. Thanks.